July 31st, 1943. Taman Peninsula, Crimea. 0 to 1700 hours. The night swallows sound. Across the front line, 4,000 meters above German positions, an engine cuts out, then another, then another. In the darkness, wooden biplanes tilt forward into silence. Wind hisses through canvas wings. Steel wires hum like violin strings tuned to death. The only warning the Wehrmacht will receive tonight is a whisper, the soft rush of air over fabric, a sound soldiers have begun to describe as the sweep of a broomstick across cobblestones. Die Nachthexen, the night witches. Tonight, 4 crews will not return from the darkness. Their names will join 32 others who flew into the black and never came back. But on this particular night, in this particular sector of a war that has already consumed millions, something remarkable is happening that the German forces below cannot yet comprehend. The pilots guiding these plywood death traps through searchlight beams are women. Girls, really. Most haven't seen their 23rd birthday, and they are winning. The summons, September 1941, Moscow. 3 months earlier, the Soviet Union was burning. Operation Barbarossa had torn through the Western territories like a firestorm. The Wehrmacht advanced 50 kilometers per day. Entire armies vanished into prisoner of war camps. Villages became ash. By September, German forces stood within artillery range of Leningrad. Moscow itself seemed inevitable. The Soviet Air Force was being annihilated in numbers that still stagger historians today. In the first 3 days of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft. By autumn, the WWII, the Wojenno-Vzduszne Sily, was hemorrhaging pilots faster than training academies could replace them. In an office overlooking Red Square, Major Marina Raskova sat surrounded by letters. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They arrived daily, written in cramped handwriting on whatever paper young women across the Soviet Union could find. The messages varied in eloquence, but not in desperation. Former flight instructors, aviation club members, university students who'd learned to fly crop dusters during summer breaks, all asking the same question: how can we fight? Marina Raskova was not someone easily dismissed. At 31, she had already achieved what most pilots only dream of. She was the first woman to become a navigator in the Soviet Air Force in 1933, and in 1938, she set an international distance record of 4,010 miles, flying from Moscow toward Komsomolsk-on-Amur in an all-female crew. When their aircraft ran out of fuel in bad weather, Raskova parachuted from the unprotected navigator's compartment and survived 10 days in the wilderness without food or water before finding her crew. The Soviet propaganda machine had made her a celebrity, their answer to Amelia Earhart. She was one of the first 3 women ever awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. She used that celebrity like a crowbar. On September 8, 1941, Raskova gave a speech calling for women pilots to be welcomed into combat roles. Using her personal connection with Joseph Stalin, she convinced him to allow the formation of all-female combat aviation units. Stalin was quick to approve, recognizing their tremendous international propaganda value. On October 8, 1941, Order number 0099 specified the creation of 3 women's air regiments. All personnel, from pilots to mechanics to ground crews, would be exclusively female. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment would fly Yak-1 fighters. The 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment would pilot twin-engine P-2 dive bombers, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment would become legend. Within weeks, Raskova had selected her candidates. From more than 2,000 applications, she chose around 400 women for the Night Bomber Regiment. Most were clever, educated, very talented girls, already trained through WWII the Society for Cooperation in Defense and Aviation. They ranged in age from 17 to 26, most of them students. They were sent to Engels, a small industrial town north of Stalingrad, where the real test would begin. Engels School of Aviation. December 1941. The training was designed to break them. The recruits were expected to learn in a few months what it took most soldiers several years to grasp. They trained as pilots, navigators, mechanics, and ground crews simultaneously. In winter, temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, they learned to maintain engines with frozen fingers, to navigate by dead reckoning when instruments failed, to land on improvised airstrips cleared from snow-covered fields. The Soviet military issued them uniforms. Men's uniforms. The women wore oversized tunics and boots so large they had to stuff them with rags. When they protested, they were told to be grateful they had boots at all. But the greatest insult came when they saw their aircraft. The Polikarpov Po-2 was never designed for war. Originally designated the U-2 and intended for crop dusting and training civilian pilots, it was a 1928 design made of plywood covered with canvas. With a top speed of roughly 60 miles per hour when fully loaded and a cruising speed of 68 miles per hour, it was incredibly slow. The open cockpit biplane could carry only 2 bombs, one under each wing, with a maximum payload of about 350 kilograms. Some of the women called it a coffin with wings. If a tracer bullet struck the canvas, the entire aircraft could burst into flames. The weight of the bombs and the low altitude required for missions meant pilots didn't carry parachutes until 1944. They flew too low for parachutes to open anyway. The Po-2 had no radio, no defensive armament beyond a single machine gun in the rear cockpit that often jammed in the cold. The planes were too small to appear on radar or infrared locators. No heating system existed in the open cockpits. In winter operations, pilots wrapped their faces in scarves, but their breath still froze to the instruments. Yet this antique crop duster possessed one quality that would transform it into something the Germans would learn to fear. It was too slow to be caught. The stall speed of German Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and Fokker-Wulf Fu-190 fighters was similar to or higher than the Po-2's maximum speed. German pilots attempting to engage the biplanes found themselves unable to slow down enough to maintain a firing solution without stalling and falling from the sky themselves. The Po-2 could also take off and land almost anywhere. Forest clearings, dirt roads, fields barely longer than a football pitch. Its high-lift biplane configuration afforded significant maneuverability and the ability to operate from airfields in close proximity to the front lines. And it was almost silent. By February 1942, training was complete. The 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment deployed to the southern front. They were commanded by Major Yevdokia Vershanskaya, a stern, methodical pilot who would lead them for the entire war without being replaced, unlike the other 2 women's regiments, which would eventually receive male commanders. At its largest, the 588th had 42-person crews. Each team consisted of a pilot and a navigator who doubled as bombardier. They operated from improvised airfields within kilometers of the front lines. Their first combat missions launched in June 1942. Within weeks, the Germans had given them their nickname. Summer 1942, North Caucasus Front. The tactic was born from desperation and refined through horror. As each pilot approached her target, she would throttle the engine to idle or cut it completely. The plane would glide silently toward the target, guided only by the pilot's skill and the navigator's directions. The weight of the bombs attached to the wings pulled the aircraft into a silent descent as the pilot adjusted the nose to keep level with the target. The only sound German soldiers heard was an ominous whooshing, wind rushing through the biplane's bracing wires, like the sweep of a witch's broom through the night sky. Then came the bombs. the women flew in formations of 3. 2 planes would veer off as decoys, attracting searchlights and anti-aircraft fire while zigzagging to avoid being hit. The 3rd plane would idle its engine and glide through the darkness to the target. After dropping both bombs, they would restart the engine, if it restarted. The cold often made engines seize, and fly back to base. Then they would refuel, reload, and fly again, and again, and again. A typical pilot flew 800 missions during the war. Veteran pilots Yekaterina Ryabova and Nadezhda Popova flew 18 missions in a single night. The most flown by any pilot was 1,008 sorties. Most pilots spent 10 hours in the air nightly, returning physically and mentally exhausted. The mathematics of exhaustion compound. 10 hours nightly, multiple bombing runs per sortie. Every approach requiring perfect timing, perfect coordination between pilot and navigator, perfect nerve. A single mistake, stalling during the glide, misjudging altitude, being caught by searchlights during the vulnerable approach, meant death. Sometimes the intense cold jammed the bomb release mechanisms, and navigators had to climb out onto the wings in flight to kick the bombs free. The psychological effect on German forces proved devastating. The main goal was to disrupt sleep and destroy morale through near-constant night attacks. The incessant bombardment turned soldiers into virtual zombies. Germans began to spread rumors that the Soviet women had been given chemicals that gave them cat-like night vision. Some claimed they weren't human at all, but actual witches. The Luftwaffe offered iron crosses to any pilot who could shoot one down. The women of the 588th kept a list of rules. The first commandment was, "Be proud, you are a woman." They decorated their planes with flowers, used navigation pencils as lipstick, and sewed underwear from silk parachute flares. Between missions, they did needlework, wrote letters home, and danced to whatever music they could find on crackling radios. They remained defiantly themselves. But they were also dying. July 31st, 1943. Taman Peninsula. The Blue Line was supposed to be impenetrable. The Germans had fortified the Taman Peninsula with interlocking fields of fire, dense anti-aircraft batteries, and searchlight networks that could illuminate the sky like daylight. Major Maria Smirnova described it as firmly backed by strong anti-aircraft defenses, networked by searchlights, anti-aircraft batteries, and machine guns. The 588th had been ordered to break through. For weeks, they flew into that wall of fire every night. On July 31st, 1943, 8 women from 4 different crews were killed when their planes burst into flames after being struck by tracer rounds. Most burned like sheets of paper because they still weren't issued parachutes. Smirnova herself was shot down when tracer bullets severed her aileron control wires. She and her navigator barely escaped before their aircraft disintegrated on landing. July 31st was the regiment's greatest single loss. But they kept flying. For another month, through August 1943, they hammered at German positions on the Taman Peninsula. Eventually, the Germans were stripped of their fortified position and then the rest of Crimea. In recognition of their service, in February 1943, the 588 was redesignated the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, marking them as an elite unit. But elite status didn't make the mission safer. They faced not only enemy fire, but the inherent dangers of flying obsolete aircraft in extreme conditions. Engines failed, wings iced over, pilots became disoriented in clouds and crashed into hillsides. Some crews simply vanished, their fate unknown, lost in the vastness of the Eastern Front. 32 members of the regiment died during the war from combat, crashes, and even tuberculosis. And then there was Marina Raskova. On January 4, 1943, Raskova was leading two P-2 bombers to an airfield near Stalingrad when her aircraft crashed, attempting a forced landing on the Volga bank. Her entire crew perished. She received the first state funeral of the war. Her ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall on Red Square. The woman who had convinced Stalin to let them fly would never see the victory she'd made possible. But her pilots kept flying through 1943, through 1944, through the liberation of Crimea, the liberation of Belarus, the liberation of Poland, all the way to Berlin, the Eastern Front. 1942 to 1945. The statistics are difficult to process even now, 8 decades later. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew more than 23,000 combat sorties. They collectively logged 28,676 flight hours. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells. They damaged or destroyed 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored cars, 86 firing positions, and 11 searchlights. They also made 155 supply drops of food and ammunition to Soviet forces. On December 22, 1944, the regiment flew 324 bombing runs in a single night, their highest number of missions in one evening. The Night Witches participated in every major Soviet offensive on the southern and central Eastern Front. They supported the defense of the Transcaucasus, the liberation of Novorossiysk, the Crimean offensive, the Belarus offensive, and the liberation of Gdansk. Their campaigns aided the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. 23 members were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, more than any other female unit in the Soviet military. The unit was the most highly decorated female unit in the Soviet Air Force. These numbers represent more than tactical success. They represent something the architects of Operation Barbarossa had never anticipated, that Soviet women flying obsolete training aircraft would become one of the most effective harassment units on the Eastern Front. Male pilots initially discriminated against the women, doubting their abilities. Those doubts evaporated quickly once the women proved their effectiveness in combat. The Po-2 itself became a symbol of Soviet ingenuity, turning a liability into an asset. The aircraft's slow speed and quiet operation made it nearly invisible to German defenses. Its ability to operate from primitive airstrips meant the regiment could stay close to advancing Soviet forces, and the psychological impact was incalculable. German soldiers never knew when the whisper would come. Some nights brought dozens of attacks. Some nights brought silence. The uncertainty was its own weapon, corroding morale and preventing rest. But for the women who flew those missions, victory came at a price that statistics cannot capture. May 1945, Berlin. When Soviet forces entered Berlin in April 1945, Night Witches flew overhead. The regiment participated in the Battle of Berlin, their final combat missions of the war. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the women of the 588 had survived nearly 3 years of nightly combat. Some had flown over 1,000 missions. They had become experts in the art of survival, reading weather, memorizing terrain, communicating through hand signals when radios failed or were deliberately kept silent. They expected to continue flying. Instead, the unit was disbanded shortly after the war ended. Most of the women aviators were not allowed to continue serving in the Soviet military. Some found civilian aviation work. Others worked in factories or professional fields. The message was clear. Their service had been necessary during the emergency of war, but normalcy required their return to traditional roles. Many faced the social pressures of deciding to place more importance on family instead of an aviation or military career. For decades after the war, their story was told primarily within the Soviet Union. Most English-language books and articles ignored this part of World War II history. In the West, the Night Witches remained an obscure footnote, if they were mentioned at all. The Cold War froze memory along ideological lines. Soviet heroes became invisible to Western audiences. The Night Witches were filed away in archives, their accomplishments known mainly to military historians and aviation enthusiasts. But memory has a way of surviving. Today, there are no more Night Witches. The last survivors passed away in the early 2000s. Nadezhda Popova, who flew over 800 missions, died in 2013 at age 91. The final witnesses to those dark nights above the Eastern Front are gone. What remains are the stories they left behind. Stories of women barely out of their teens, climbing into wooden biplanes held together with canvas and wire. Stories of cutting engines in the dark and gliding towards searchlight beams. Stories of bombs kicked loose by frozen hands. Stories of 18 missions in one night. Stories of burning planes and friends who never returned. Stories that challenge our assumptions about courage, about capability, about who fights and why. The Night Witches were not allowed to fight because their society believed in gender equality. Their acceptance was based on practicality and necessity, not equality. They were permitted to risk their lives in obsolete aircraft while male units flew modern planes. They were issued uniforms that didn't fit and told to be grateful. Yet they flew anyway. They flew because their country was being destroyed. They flew because their families were dying. They flew because Marina Raskova had convinced Stalin to give them a chance, and they would not waste it. They followed 12 commandments. The first was, "Be proud you are a woman." The second might as well have been, "Never let them forget what you can do." In the silence between engine shutdown and bomb release, in the seconds of gliding through darkness toward fire, in the whoosh of wind through wire and canvas. In those moments, the Night Witches wrote their own history, a history that refused to stay buried. The German soldiers who called them Nachthexen meant it as mockery. The women adopted the name as armor and wore it with pride. "Let the enemy believe we are witches," they said. "Let them fear the sound of our approach. Let them lie awake at night, wondering when the whisper will return. The whisper of a witch's broom sweeping through the darkness. The whisper of women who refused to be spectators in their own war. The whisper that said, 'We are here. We are capable. We will not be forgotten.'" Between 1942 and 1945, the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment flew 23,672 combat missions, more than any other Soviet aviation unit of comparable size. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and 26,000 incendiary shells. 32 members died in service. 23 were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. After the war, most were barred from continuing their military careers. Their story remained largely unknown in the West for half a century. Today, the Night Witches are recognized as among the most effective combat units of World War II. They proved that courage has no gender, only a willingness to fly into the dark. June 28, 1942. Southern Front, Soviet Union, the engine cuts. Below, German headquarters burns. The pilot banks into darkness, already planning the next run. There will be 7 more tonight, maybe 8. The navigator crouches behind her, fingers numb from cold, clutching the map they'll need to find their way back. They are ghosts. They are witches. They are women who were told they couldn't and decided they would. Over 23,000 sorties, over 3,000 tons of bombs, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, 32 dead. The history books forgot them for decades, but the German soldiers who heard that soft whooshing in the night never did. Neither should we.